or analytical historical studies, this is just one of those sections you get lost in for days. It is quite good. But we're going to try to get from Noah to Abram tonight, so let's pray and move on. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity to open your word, and I pray, Lord, that you would guide my thoughts and my words, and you would guide our thoughts tonight, that we would hear what it is out of this passage you want us to know. We thank you. Amen. Do you guys remember when the Mayflower landed on Plymouth Rock? Anybody remember the year? 1620. Look at that. People paying attention in elementary school. That's awesome. 1620. There were approximately 22 families or 22 family units that came from the Mayflower. That is 51 of the original 102 Pilgrim settlers survived. Of that 51, 37 went on to have children of their own, and that 37 represents 22 familial connections. Okay? That was about 400 years ago that they did that. Currently, they have about 35 million descendants. There are about 35 million people that we can guarantee through DNA studies have descended from those 37 people or 22 families in 400 years. Understand that is 10% of the United States population. Think of how far those Mayflower people have come in 400 years. Think about the difference between 1620 and today. We tend to look back on this time period that we're going to talk about between Noah and Abram and think about a bunch of, I don't know, nomadic people that lived in tents because they couldn't figure out how to build buildings and had no common sense and no capabilities. But the fact of the matter is, there are, depending on who's counting, roughly 400 years between Noah and Abram, and the population of the earth exploded, and knowledge increased in some amazing, incredible ways that I'm just not even going to have time to discuss tonight. People figured things out then that we honestly have lost and are still trying to figure out now. And the world became a very different place. Now, we're going to start tonight actually in Genesis 9, because I'm thinking in my mind that the chapter break there at Genesis 9 verse 18, or pardon me, that the verse break at Genesis 9 verse 18 ought to be a chapter break. The section we're going to look at tonight we'll call the Table of Nations. And the beginning of the Table of Nations is the story in Genesis 9 starting in verse 18. Now understand that there are quite a few years between verse 17 and verse 18. We don't know how long. There's a gap there, and nobody seems to want to tell us how long, and that's fine. It well could have been over 100-year gap between 17 and 18. Remember that Noah lived 350 years after getting off the ark. This is quite a ways later. By the time we're having this discussion, Noah's boys have boys of their own. They might even have grandbabies by the time we're having this discussion. Quite a few years have gone by. That's important to note. Here is the story, starting in verse 18. Noah's sons who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Now hold on a minute. Right now, later we're going to talk about who had who for a kid. But right now, this is the only one that's brought up. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were Noah's sons, and from them the whole earth was populated. There's already the separating out of one particular grandchild. That's really significant, especially in the way that the original Hebrew writers put this kind of thing together. They want you to pay attention to that. They bring it up as if we already know Canaan. They bring that up in that sort of a way. I've had kids in the youth group over the years who had a reputation. Let's just call one Fred. And all of the other people, the moms and dads that had teenagers in the church, they all knew Fred, right? Well, one day Fred's mom came to church. And I said, oh, hi, this is Jane. And oh, hi, Jane. And they're shaking hands. And I say, this is Fred's mom. And you see their face go, because Fred has a reputation. Okay, that's what's happening here. Canaan has a reputation. There's already a reputation with this guy. And the author wants you to know where that boy and his reputation came from. They came from Ham. That's going to be important in a minute. Verse 20. Noah, as a man of the soil, began planting a vineyard. Well, I always thought Noah was a carpenter, a shipbuilder. No, Noah was a farmer and a vine dresser. That's what he liked to do. And so when he got off of the boat, he started planting a vineyard. I totally understand. We had these grapes that Wendy and I grew from little saplings in our yard there in Washington, and I missed that. I mean, I can't really do that here, I guess. But I understand. He wanted to get back to what he knew. He wanted to get back to what he enjoyed. Now, verse 21, he drank some of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself inside of his tent. We need to stop there for just a moment. That indicates that he had done something wrong. The way that verse is put together, the way that sentence is written, tells us that he had done something wrong. What was it? Was it making wine? Well, no, Jesus did that. John chapter 2, Cana in Galilee. Was it drinking wine? Well, no, Jesus did that. Matter of fact, he took a little chalice of wine and said, everybody pass it around, everybody drink some. Okay? Couldn't have been that. Was it being uncovered inside of his tent? You know, for years people thought so. That getting naked, even in your own bedroom, was a wrong thing to do. And so the Anglo people, the English people, for a period of a few hundred years, from the Middle Ages up until the Elizabethan era, they never took baths. They did not bathe because that required getting naked. So we figured out that was not the problem. That was the English people from the Middle Ages up till the Elizabethan era. Yeah, the Irish people couldn't stand the English people because they couldn't be in the same room with them. Anyway, they figured out that was a bad idea. And honestly, Jewish people actually are well known for bathing. Jewish people from the time of the original Jewish nation on through the Roman conquest were known for their cleanliness by the other nations around them. You got a couple million Jews together for, say, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the city didn't stink. And it had to do with the Levitical laws that we'll get into later. They were very clean people. So that wasn't the issue. It wasn't the wine, it wasn't making the wine, it wasn't drinking the wine, and it wasn't uncovering himself inside his tent. The issue is that he became drunk. And here's the issue with that. The Bible tells us repeatedly to avoid getting ourselves into a situation where we have lost control of ourselves. And that the number one way to do that is through the abuse of some kind of chemical or substance. You can lose control of yourself. You should be in control of yourself. Really don't have time to dig into it tonight, and I wish I did because it's a super interesting study. And I would be able to tell you why it is the Church of the Nazarene requires that its leaders don't take part in alcohol. It has nothing to do with the fact that alcohol is sinful. That's not the issue. It has to do with the fact that some people really struggle with alcohol. And alcohol and other similar chemicals and substances are known to destroy people's lives and their families and their homes and cause problems for generations. And in the Church of the Nazarene, we want those folks who are dealing with substance abuse to be able to come into our church and find help in healing and wholeness without sitting down at the table with the preacher when he cracks open a beer. They need to be able to know that it's okay to be in this place and not dwell in that. I wish we really had time to get in that. Read Proverbs 20 sometime. And it will point out the, can I say stupidity, of pursuing a life of drunkenness. That was the problem. Now, why was that a problem? Well, because of verse 22. Ham, the father of Canaan, it brings it up again, Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Was it wrong for him to be naked in his own room? What's Ham's deal? I'll tell you Ham's deal. Ham is not the firstborn. Now, whether or not he was the physical firstborn, I don't know, but Shem is the legal firstborn. Shem is the one who will inherit the blessing. Therefore, Shem is the one who inherits his father's position of leadership. Ham is coming and saying, Dad's not ready, or Dad is not capable of continuing in leadership. You see Dad in there? He got himself drunk. He can't control himself anymore. He can't be leader. We need a new leader. We need a new chief. He is usurping the traditional leadership role of the father over the clan. This was a big deal at that time. Ham says, Dad can't do it anymore. You know who's ready to take over the reins of leadership? Oh, not me. I would never pursue that for myself, Ham says. But my son Canaan, he's ready to pursue leadership. We should make him chief instead of Dad. That old guy, he's just losing it. He doesn't know Monday from Tuesday anymore. We need to get him out of there. Well, Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over their shoulders, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Why? Because it was bad to be naked in your tent? No, because this was a very kind and polite way of allowing their father to maintain some dignity. You know, in 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, love bears all things, it literally means love covers. Love covers. And here, out of love, they're covering their father. Oh, I wish we had time to study that. It's so deep and rich because the blood of Christ covers us. The very first thing that God did from Adam and Eve, when He found them in the garden and they were sinful and they were naked and they were ashamed, is He covered them. Shem and Japheth covered their father. We got you covered, Dad. Well, later, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him. What had his youngest son done? Gone outside and said, Dad's naked in there. Nope. Had he gone out and said, oh, there's Dad getting drunk again? Nope. What he did was started a mutiny. What he did was said, Dad is no longer fit to be in charge of us. Well, apparently Noah was still fit to be in charge of them because he dealt with the situation. And he said, Canaan is cursed. Why Canaan? Because Canaan is the one who's trying to be in charge. Canaan is the one who is trying to use their father's, grandfather in this case, mistake to usurp his authority. Canaan is the one who is stepping out of line here. He already has a reputation. Now he's living up to that reputation of being an absolute rebel against the plan of God for the family. Cursed is Canaan. Instead of being the ruler, he says, he will be the lowest of slaves for his brothers. He also said, blessed be Shem? No. Blessed be Yahweh, God of Shem. Because Shem is a God follower. Because Shem lives his life in such a way that God will be lifted up. The thing that Shem wants more than anything else is for his God to be blessed. And Noah recognizes this. And he says, then for Shem, let's have the Lord be happy with him. Let's have the Lord smile on him. When the Lord thinks about Shem, when he looks down on Shem, let's have that put a big smile on the Lord's face. But Canaan will be his slave. Now, you say, oh, that sounds bad. Canaan has to be the slave. Who's he the slave of? The most God-fearing one of all. Now, if you've got to be a servant, who do you want to be a servant of? You want to be a servant of the most God-fearing person you can find. Someone who loves God and respects God and is going to treat you with love and respect as a result. What looks like an immediate slap in the face is Noah showing grace. Now, Canaan's going to be the slave because he tried to usurp. He tried to steal the reins. So not only is he never going to get the reins, now he's going to have to serve the rest. But you know who would be good for him to serve is Shem, because Shem lives in the love of God. Regarding Japheth, verse 27, let God extend Japheth, grow Japheth, spread Japheth out. In other words, let him be very prolific in multiplication and spread out widely. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, when Japheth is living under the authority or living in a relationship with Shem that allows Shem to lead, well, at that time, let him be heavily blessed. As long as he stays in line, follows the pattern and the path. And Canaan, will be Shem's slaves. Will he be Japheth's slave? No, not necessarily. Well, what's wrong with Japheth? Oh, nothing, but Shem lives in the love of God. Okay, so do you see what laid down here? That's just so important. If you can understand that, and if you can understand Genesis chapter 10, which we're just going to skip across tonight like a rock skipping across a pond. If you can understand those things, then the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in the 21st century makes a tremendous great deal of sense. That's where it starts. Canaan is cursed. He will be a slave or servant of Shem because Shem walks in the light and love of God. And Japheth, he's going to be prolific. And as long as he lives in the proper order with Shem, then he'll share in the blessing of God. Okay, it's about to make sense. Verse 28, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So Noah's life lasted 950 years and then he died. Wait, why did Noah live so long? And now everybody's life is going to get shorter and shorter. And if you follow the numbers, which we're not going to do tonight, you'll see that every subsequent generation's life gets just a little bit shorter. Well, it has to do with the atmospheric and topographical changes on this planet after the flood. We talked a little bit about that before. We can certainly talk about it again if you like, but I'm just going to throw that out there. The world changed. People could no longer live as long. There's been tremendous historical and anthropological studies about this, even from people who try to come from an anti-biblical background and believe in the whole millions of years theory. They can see a difference in people as they age through here, particularly in things like the size of nostrils related to the size of body. We have bigger nostrils now related to the size of body than folks did during the Neanderthal time, which would be people like this. And honestly, a lot of modern studies have shown that what we've called there was one that I was reading just a couple weeks ago. I should have pulled, no, I think it was just a few days ago. I should have pulled it for this. Anyway, which was identifying Northeastern and Northwestern Europeans, two separate groups, that had been labeled as Neanderthals, but was showing that in fact, they're some of the groups of people we're going to talk about here tonight. Anyway, there has been a change in us physiologically. Listen, let's just take a second and touch on evolution. There are two types of evolution that every studious scientific person will talk about. There is macroevolution and there's microevolution. Macroevolution is changes between kinds. A fish becomes a kangaroo, becomes a man. Nope, there's no evidence for it. The more we learn about DNA and about cell structure and these kinds of things, it's physically impossible. Can't happen. But then there's what's called microevolution, and that's evolution within a kind, and that's obvious, and we see it all the time. My dog Timothy is a purebred Great Dane. But there was a time not too long ago when Great Danes didn't exist. He is a mixture in his heritage between a greyhound, an Irish wolfhound, and an English mastiff. That's how they made those guys. And they came up with a whole new thing. Well, where did the wolfhound come from? Well, the wolfhound, if you trace it back far enough, actually came from wolves. But through selective breeding, we were able to bring about this thing. People are the same. People are the same. Why are they all of the native people in Africa dark-skinned, particularly North Africa where the sun is so strong? Well, because those are the people that exist best in that climate. They congregated there, they bred there. What about the really white people way up north in Scandinavia where I'm from? Same thing. And the people who do best stay, and the people who don't move on, and you have selective breeding. Microevolution. Those are things that we're going to see. All right, chapter 10. We're going to go so quick on this. Stop me if you got questions, and if we have to, somebody's laughing because we're not going to go quick. Hey, listen, I just skipped 4 pages of notes, I want you to know. Right there. I would love to go through the whole thing, but my director and producer has told me that I have an expiration time. These are the family records or the genealogical records of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they also had sons after the flood. Here comes the first one. Notice that they are out of order. They're actually backwards. We're going to start with the youngest, Japheth. Japheth's sons, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Juvan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Gomer's sons, Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togmara, and Javan's sons, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Let's talk about those guys for a second. Japheth. Japheth becomes the father of what we refer to as the Indo-European peoples, which accounts for all of us here to at least some extent. Now, I want you to know that the things I'm going to tell you about the Table of Nations are not things that I made up or have assumed or have come from people who made up or assumed. These are things that have deep historical roots. These are things we know from deep historical roots from multiple cultures. So if you question some of this stuff, there are answers for it. I got answers in here. You can ask me about it. I'm just not going to spend a tremendous amount of time digging into them. But there are historical records that go all the way back to cuneiform, the original written language of these kinds of things, explaining to us who these people groups are. Gomer is the first son that's mentioned. Gomer founded a group that was known at one point as the Gimmerai, which then became the Cimmeri, or the Cimmerians, or we might say Crimea. They went to the area of Crimea in the northern Black Sea area. That would be Gomer. They also went westward, and this is really interesting. The Welsh people have a story of history that tells us that the Welsh people, the people group who were uniquely Welsh, migrated from Turkey to what's now France, to the area that is now Wales, 300 years after the flood, and they can trace their lineage all the way back to Gomer. To this day, the Welsh people will. Also, as Gomer spread out, he left traces of family in Germany, in France, in northwest Spain, and a number of different areas, and they are all related. You can see it really well in their linguistics. The Gauls, you've heard of the Gauls, that would be Germans. The Gomerag, which is Cymerag, or Cambria, which is like Bavaria in Germany. You've heard of the Franks, which is France. All of these people trace their heritage back to this one group, the sons of Gomer. And by the way, that's mentioned in Ezekiel 38:6, but it's also mentioned in the records of a king by the name of Guru, which he was writing about Esarhaddon, king of Assyria. So these things go back, that goes back 700 years before Christ. These things go back a long way. That's Gomer. I take a little time on Gomer because a lot of us in this room, I would venture to say probably all of us in this room, have at least a portion of our ancestry, if not all of our ancestry, that comes from Gomer and his descendants. So that's Gomer. Magog, this guy's so interesting and plays a huge role in biblical prophecy and in biblical history. This guy Magog. Magog appears in Ezekiel, he appears in Revelation, and he appears in a few other areas. Magog and the families that came from Magog, the Magogites, were a group of people that the Greeks called the Scythians, and they went to Romania, Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe. Now, we're going to skip down in a couple minutes, and we're going to read about Magog's sons in just a little bit. And I can't find the verse, but when we get there, I'll tell you we're there. We'll read about Magog's sons, Meshech and Tubal. Those two names are still used as place names and people group names today. Tubal, that it says in your kind of weirdly translated Hebrew sort of into English, is Tobol, and there's a city called Tobolsk on the Tobol River in Siberia. It was the first Russian settlement in Siberia, and the people there, the Siberian people there, were Tobolsk people, and they came from the family of Gomer. Interestingly enough, the people who conquered them were also Gomerite people, but they look totally different. Meshech is a term that has gone down through the years and been transliterated a few times, and you know the term. It's the term Moscow. The Moscowites are Meshechites. Yes. Magog is the ancestor of both the Scythians and the Goths. You've heard of the Goths? The Visigoths and the Goths. And Irish Celts, if anybody's Irish or Celtic, then you trace right back to Magog. I'm telling you what, Japheth did exactly what Noah said and really spread out. Now, the Madai is the next, or the Madai is the next one that you see. That's the next son, Madai. That would be the Medes. You've heard of the Medes and the Persians? These people are modern-day Iran, and if you talk to someone who is Iranian, he will tell you he is Persian, and if he really wants to tell you, like he thinks you might understand his history, he'll tell you he's Median or Medo-Persian. You know, there's a tremendous amount of tension between Iran and Iraq and between Iran and Saudi Arabia because they are not the same kind of people. Iraq are Arab people. We'll talk about them in a minute. Saudi Arabia are Arab people. We'll talk about them in a minute. And sandwiched in there are these Japhethites. And yeah, to you and me, it might look like they're similar or have similar customs, but to them, they are opposites. Opposite types of peoples. And they've never gotten along. They're Japhethites. The Iranian people are more like the people in this room than the peoples around them. And of course, the Medes are all over the Bible. You can see them. Oh my gosh, I've got this list here. Trust me, you can look them up. You can see them. Javan. Interestingly, that's not Japan. Javan. Listen, we did a really bad job of transliterating terms. Javan should be more like Ioan. And that would be the Ionian people, or what we would call the Hellenistic people, out of which came the Greeks, and the Mesopotamians, and those kinds of people. Javan. They're going to play a really big role as we go through. Interestingly enough, we talked about how the Welsh and the Celts are Gomerites, but the Britons are Javanites, as well as are the Saxons, and the Lombards, and the Bavarians, and the Albans. A lot of the groups that made up what settled on the British Isles came from that group. And to this day, they argue and fuss and fight. All right, we talked about Tubal and Meshech. Oh, and Tiras, he doesn't play as big of a role in there. You heard of the Thracians? They come from Tiras. The only interesting really thing that I found about Tiras is that the god Thor originated with him. He came up with that idea, or his group came up with that idea. Okay, now, there are 3 sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. And these guys are really interesting. Ashkenaz is a Hebrew term for what we call Germany. And to this day, if you go to Israel, you'll see 2 basic socioeconomic groups of Jews. There's the Ashkenazi Jews, and I can never remember, thank you, Sephardic. I can never remember that name. Oh, it's right there in my notes, Sephardic. The Sephardic Jews, during the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora in the 1st century when Rome came in and just squashed whatever was left of the Jewish nation, the Sephardic Jews are people who moved kind of like over to Spain and Portugal. The Ashkenazi Jews are people that moved to Central Europe. And many of them settled in Germany. And they were quite successful there, and they did really well there, and they were great patriots for their homeland right up until 1940, when this guy named Adolf had enough of Ashkenazi Jews. And their history is very well established. Rephath, we won't spend any time on him. Togarmah, they're Armenian, and the name Turk or Turkey or Turkmenistan comes from that term. And they've been around a long time. The Hittites referred to them in the 14th century BC. The Hittites returned. The Assyrians talked about them. They're a group of people, the Turks, they're a group of people that have been around and been known in history for a long time. Okay, verse 4. I hope this is as interesting to you as it is to me. Probably not, so bear with me. It's going to get really good in a couple minutes. Javon's son, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodaman. Elisha, these were people who traded in purple with Tyre, I should say. Ezekiel talks about them. Tarshish, you remember Tarshish? Jonah? Remember? He spent a few days fishing when he was supposed to go to Nineveh. Instead, he went to Tarshish. This is the plain we're talking about. That's like the Western Mediterranean, like the region of the Spanish peninsula. Kittim is really interesting. It's known as Chittim by the Hebrews, and that whole people group ended up settling on Cyprus. And because they're settled on Cyprus, they've managed to stay fairly genetically pure, their DNA, so you can learn a lot from them and trace them back. And the other interesting thing is Cyprus is the most Christian of Christian nations that we have now. That's what happened to those people. And Dodanim, they are people in Asia Minor, and we'll talk about them some more later. Verse 5, from these descendants, the people of the coasts and islands spread out onto their lands according to their own clans and their own nations, each with their own language, or each with their own lips, it literally says. Now, we're going to talk about language in a little bit, but he's making the point that as these people spread out, their dialects changed until the point that their language was changed. Now, linguistics have done studies of these groups, and they can link all their languages together and show the common origins of their language. But they've each changed a little bit or a lot as they move to the different areas. Interestingly about the Japhethites, when they spread out, they went to the very edges of things. They went as far north as it was thought that you could go before there was no more land. They went as far west as it was thought that you could go before there was no more land. I mean, they went to the British Isles, for Pete's sake. There's nothing out there. That's what these people did. They spread out in ways that were unlike the other groups that we're going to read about in a minute. Another interesting thing about these guys is they were known as savages for a long time, uncouth and uncivilized. Even the Romans in their day, who considered themselves to be the most civilized and everybody else was barbarians, even if you look at their practices, the Asiatic and African people thought the Romans were uncouth and uncivilized. Interesting. Something happened after that made this people group become the ones who picked up civilization and ran with it. Do you ever have to study history of Western civilization in school? The history of Western civilization started with the Greeks and the Romans, who were known to the rest of the world as uncivilized. Something happened that changed that. And it wasn't Plato. What happened was, in 315 AD, they stepped into the tents of Shem. Those people groups Christianized. And when they Christianized, their cultures began to become what we refer to today as civilized. Things begin to be important to them, like how we treat one another. One anthropologist, really good anthropologist that I've read quite a bit, and I just can't remember her name off the top of my head. Anyway, she was asked at one point, what was the beginning of human civilization? And she's done a lot of anthropological archaeology. In other words, digging up old human bones and trying to figure out what was happening. And she said that by her estimation, the beginning of civilization was when she found a skeleton whose arm had been broken but was healed. She said, that's the beginning of civilization. And the person said, what are you talking about? We're expecting you to tell us about a big city or a big thing. She said, no. Because if you break your arm, you're helpless. You can't fix that yourself. And you're going to die unless others gather around you and help you. So she said, seeing a healed, broken arm tells me that this was a person who got into a really bad spot. and other people came around and helped this person, and carried this person along until the point of healing. That's the beginning of civilization. You think about the Romans. I know they had Roman numerals and chariots. They were also brutal to one another. I mean, if they had a baby and they didn't like the way it looked, they just put it outside. They just put it outside. And a wealthy man would marry a woman, and the whole purpose of that woman was simply to have kids. He would have another woman for pleasure and another woman to talk to, and then this one just for kids. They were brutal and uncivilized people until Christianity took hold. They stepped into the tents of Shem. And when they did, it revolutionized Greco-Roman culture. And everywhere the gospel has gone, everywhere it's gone, all around the world. I don't mean everywhere religious people have gone. I mean everywhere the gospel has gone. It's civilized cultures. So that's that. Ham's sons, starting in verse 6. Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan. Cush, well, that's the land of Cush or Nubia or Ethiopia. These are other people who've managed to stay pretty ethnically pure. They're not like really diverse ethnically or in their DNA. Jeremiah 13 and Isaiah 45 make interesting statements about how these people are very tall and very dark-skinned. Well, that's what the Ethiopian people are like today. I think that Jeremiah and Isaiah mention that for the NBA scouts, but nonetheless, these are the tall, dark-skinned people. Mizraim, this is Egypt. It's still to this day the Hebrew word for Egypt. We'll just skip that and talk about them later. Put is Libya, because there was a guy named Phut, P-H-U-T, who founded Libya, and his inhabitants were the Phutites. How'd you like to be that? I tell you this whole thing just so I can say Phutites. And that was, the name of the land wasn't changed until much later by a king by the name of Mizraim. But anyway, that's Libya. And then Canaan. We know about Canaan. Canaan, well, some Canaanites did some really good things, like the Phoenicians. You've heard of the Phoenicians. They came up with a concept called phonetics. Hebrew is a phonetic language. They developed that idea of writing sounds down, unlike the hieroglyphics of Egypt. They had this phonetic system that many other people groups attached to. There were some Canaanites who did really good things. There was a group of Canaanites who were not so positive. And we're going to end up talking about them some. They went and settled in the Middle East, the Canaanites. Cush's sons, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, Sebekta, and Rama's sons, Sheba and Dedan. Seba is the Sabaeans. You've heard of them. They're on the southwest coast of Africa to this day. Havilah, those are the Arabs in Iraq and Arabia. And Sheba and Dedan, that is the Saudis. You've heard of the Saudis? Saudi Arabia? That's where they're from. That's Sheba and Dedan. Now it gets super interesting. So if you haven't been cluing into all that history, it's going to start clicking here in a minute. And this is wild. Verse 8, Cush fathered Nimrod, who began to be powerful in the land. He was a powerful hunter in the sight of, literally against, a powerful hunter against the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a powerful hunter against the Lord. His kingdom started with Babylon, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ur, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and the great city of Calah. Who is this guy? He is vitally important. Nimrod is vitally important. His name means, let us rebel. That's his name. Nimrod's name, let us rebel. And what was he rebelling against? Well, he was rebelling against the curse that his brothers would be slaves to Shem. And he's rebelling against God, and he's rebelling against the system of God. And he is about to say, I should be in charge. He was incredibly, we know who this guy was. He has a number of different names. Nemus is a common name that you'll come across for him. Some people equate him with the first Sargon. It's possible, but probably not. He's well known in history, this guy. I'll read you this thing. It was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man of great strength of hand. He persuaded them, that would be the rest of his clan, not to ascribe to God, but through his means, they would be happy. In other words, he would take care of them. He believed it was their own courage which procured that happiness. So they're going to go be their own gods. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them to a constant dependence on its power. Stop there for a second. A lot of people say, oh, nobody even believed in Yahweh God until Abram. Abram made that up. Actually, no. People were walking with Yahweh God, and this guy Nimrod came and said, you're not going to do that anymore. If you do, I will kill you and your whole family and burn down your city or your community. And they said, okay, Nimrod, we will follow you. That term, a mighty hunter against the Lord. We're told in, it's written here in my notes somewhere. We're told a couple of places what he hunted. Here it is. This is from the Jerusalem Targum. He was powerful in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord, for he was a hunter of the sons of men. In other words, he hunted souls. And he said to them, depart from the judgment of the Lord and adhere to the judgment of Nimrod. Therefore it is said, is Nimrod the strong one, strong in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord. Do you see what he's trying to do here? He's trying to set up a governmental system contrary to the one that God set up. A rulership that's not based on the family, which was the institute of God, but based on his own system of government, which is heavy-handed and strong. He also said that he would be revenged on God. He said if he should have a mind to drown the world again, that Nimrod would build a tower too high for the waters to reach it, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. So if you submitted to Yahweh God, you were a coward. We're going to fight against him. We're going to find our own way to heaven. We're going to be our own gods. And if God should get mad at us this time and wipe us out, we're going to build a tower so high that his water can't reach it. And we're going to wipe him out. He went and he founded some cities. It started with a city called Babylon, Babel, B-A-B-E-L, Babel. That means gateway to God. That's what that word means. He built a city that was the gateway to God, and in it he built a mighty ziggurat that we're going to read about tonight because we'll have plenty of time to read about the mighty ziggurat. He built a mighty ziggurat that was, he said, the gateway to God. Erech, that's Uruk, U-R-U-K. If you are an ancient historian, look it up. That was another wicked city. Akkad, you can look that one up too. And Calneh, all in the land of Shinar. That's the plains of Iraq, which today is just a desert, but hasn't always been that way. From that land, he went north. He went to Assyria. There's a people group there already from Asher. We're going to read about them pretty soon. And he said, guess what? You belong to me now. And he built a big city called Nineveh, which became the capital of the Assyrians. And he built a couple other cities we haven't heard of. Rehoboth, well, you and I haven't heard of, but we can find pieces of them. Rehoboth, Calah, Rezin, and then of course there's the great city, they call it, of Calah. It was a big city at the time. I want to tell you a couple of things about this guy, Nimrod. You'll find him called Ninurta or Ninus. He's the Assyrian god of war, the founder of Nineveh. When they talk about that guy, that's the guy that they're talking about. You've heard of Marduk, the Babylonian king of the gods. That's him. That's Nimrod. The reason I want to talk about him is because his brand of paganism is the same brand of paganism that we have in the world today. It has not changed at all. Oh, we've tried to civilize it, but it is the same brand of paganism. They began with these ziggurats by worshiping the sky and the stars and the gods that they said were involved in the sky and the stars. They began by worshiping them. As they built more and more ziggurats, they began using them as communications towers. And we're not exactly sure how they communicated with one another, but it had to do with crystals that they said were spiritual crystals, that they could communicate with one another. We don't know the process. Nobody wrote it down. But they built these little temples on the top of the ziggurats. We have the ruins, and we have writings about them. And they put some sort of crystals in there and used them for communication, perhaps like a lighthouse. Maybe they burned something. We don't know, but they said it was spiritual. It was a supernatural form of communication. Nimrod himself promoted himself. The people had to worship something. You're not going to let them worship Yahweh God, so he said, worship me. I'll be your God. He had a wife. Her name was Semiramis. She is incredibly well known. Semiramis is honestly more well known in history than even Nimrod. One time Nimrod was out, I don't know, warring or hunting or whatever he was doing. And while he was gone, Semiramis became pregnant. Uh-oh. Oh, no, but you got to understand. This was supernatural. You see, one night while she was lying on the roof, a mighty moonbeam came. And this moonbeam inhabited her. And she became pregnant supernaturally. Do you believe that? Don't worry, neither did Nimrod. Here's the problem. He's the mighty king. She is the queen. She is to be completely under his control. For her to not be under his control is a weakness, and he is not weak. So he went with the story. She had a boy, his name was Tammuz. Tammuz is so important. She had a boy named Tammuz, and she claimed that Tammuz, of course, was a son of the moon god. By the way, parentheses, the moon god is widely worshipped today. The same moon god is widely worshipped in the world. I mean, like the second most worshipped god on the planet is the moon god. He became the moon god of Ur. We'll talk about Ur later. And to this day, if you look at the symbols of the religion of the crescent, it's the religion of the moon god, same God that supposedly brought us Tammuz. Now, Tammuz was supernaturally implanted into his mother, supposedly, around the end of March, beginning of April. And there was a festival that grew up for his conception, a festival that became known as Ishtar. And he was born in late December on our calendar. And so there was a festival that grew up on his birthday where people would give each other gifts. And his birthday was thought to be December the 25th. Does it sound at all familiar? Wait, it gets better. Tammuz, well, he wasn't gaining in popularity quick enough. So he injured himself and he disappeared from the public eye for a while. And everybody said, what happened to Tammuz? And his mom, Semiramis, said, this is what happened. Now, there are a few different versions of this account. So there's a few different stories that go with this, but this is the story that seems most presentable to me. Tammuz was out hunting tigers, and he got killed. But 3 days later, he was alive again. And so everybody wait, and Tammuz will reappear 3 days later, alive again. Oh, he's wounded, but he is alive. So we must worship him. He's a god. You see, Tammuz. You know how we worship him on his birthday? We cut down an evergreen tree, drag it in the house, deck it out with silver and gold, fasten it to a stand with hammer and nails. Because Tammuz was killed by a green tree, was killed by a wild boar or a wild tiger, but 3 days later he came back to life. So he should be exalted and worshiped. Interesting stuff. Isn't it interesting? Now, there's a reason why we carry that over into Christianity. It has to do with Constantine, and I can explain it to you tonight. Honestly, I don't have a problem with how we do Christmas. Don't get me wrong. I don't have a problem with it. And if I had time, I would get into that study. It's really interesting. If you can convince my producer to go 2 hours instead of 1, we'll dig into that. It's wildly, wildly interesting. But here's what I want you to know. Tammuz and Semiramis have never gone away. They were worshipped in Egypt as Osis and Iris. They were worshipped by the Hellenistic people as Cupid and Venus. They were worshipped in the Canaanite cultures as Ashtoreth and Baal. They were worshipped by the Romans as Fortuna and Jupiter. And they were even worshipped in the Eastern cultures under the name Shangzi. And they are still worshipped today in a variety of different ways. Semiramis became known as the Queen of Heaven. And you will read about her in the Old Testament. When we get to studying Ezekiel in 6 or 7 weeks at this rate, when we get there, we're going to read about it. In Ezekiel chapter 8, God said, Ezekiel, you will see greater abominations that the Israelites commit. And he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Israelite women weeping for Tammuz. Why are they weeping? Well, because once a year, he goes to hell to pay the price for people. And he'll be in hell for a while, depending on your tradition, 40 days or 6 months. And then he comes back. And so we weep for him while he's in hell. The Israelite people were doing that. Jeremiah 7. As for you, God says to Jeremiah, do not pray for these people or lift up a cry of prayer for them, and do not intercede with me for them, because I'm not going to hear you. Do you see what they're doing in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, the women knead the dough, and they make cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to these other gods. Now here's the thing I want you to understand about this. Have you ever seen a counterfeit $17 bill? Me neither. I've never seen a counterfeit $17 bill. I wouldn't believe it if I saw it. But I have seen a counterfeit 20, and it was really convincing. Wendy showed me. I don't know how she knew. I mean, it was really, really good. You're not going to counterfeit something that's not real. Satan knows the story. Remember, heaven exists in a time without a time. Satan knows the story. He knows how this goes, and he knows how it's going to end. He just doesn't know when on earth it's going to happen. So he launched right away. Listen, the stuff that went before the flood, it didn't work. We got to do this again. And he launched a much more concerted system of rebellion. We're going to talk about that when we get to the Tower of Babel here in 5 minutes. He launched a much more concerted system of rebellion. And he made this rebellion as believable as possible. And in order to make it believable, he counterfeited what is real. Boy, there's just so much to say about that. But that's where we're going to go today. I have 27 minutes. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, verse 13. These are the people of Mizraim, the people who ascended from Egypt. Lud, who became Libya. Anam, the Anamites were mentioned by Sargon II. He destroyed them. And Lehab he destroyed. The Naphathites, they settled in the Nile Delta. They're still part of Egypt. Parthus, they're mentioned in Isaiah 11:1 and Jeremiah 44. They're from the southern area of Egypt. King Esarhaddon conquered them in 660. Casula, that's the Philistines. And Caphtorim, they're part of the Phoenician group today. That's who those people are. Verse 14, Canaan. Parthus and Casla. Oh yeah, we already did those. Those are the guys that became the Philistines. Now, verse 15. Canaan fathered Sidon and Heth, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Girgashites, and the Hivites, and the Arkites, and the Sinites, and the Arvadites, and the Semarites, and the Hamathites. Notice that he changes there from individuals to people groups. That's kind of interesting. Those people groups are interesting. Sidon, Tyre and Sidon, the Phoenicians, we talked about them. Heth, that's the Hittites. The Hittites were a very large and powerful people. that existed in what is modern-day Israel and Jordan before anybody else. They were there. The interesting thing, and the reason I stop on the Hittites, well, many reasons, but the only one we have time to discuss, is that in cuneiform, their name is Kihate, K-H-I-T-T-A-E, Kihate, which transliterates down through the years into an English term of a Chinese word, Cathay. So the thought is, the understanding that we have from history is, as the Hittites begin to get conquered, mostly by the Egyptians and some by the Assyrians, a large group of them migrated over northeast, or more east than north, and settled in the northern part of what is today China. Now there's another group that are Chinese, and that is the last group of verse 17, the Sinites. The Sinites. Now we get a lot of terms from the Sinites. The Desert of Sin, the Desert of Sinai, Mount Sinai, those all come from that term as well, or the Sinites. But the Sinites also, as they begin to push out of their land, went to China. And as a matter of fact, our word China, believe it or not, is directly related to the word Sinite. I know it doesn't sound like it because English butchers things, but those are directly related. Those are the people that became the Chinese people, and they took with them a lot of these concepts of God and worshiping that are over there. As a matter of fact, to this day, other than the existing Chinese government, to this day, Chinese people have been incredibly sensitive to concepts of Yahweh. Now, gosh, I wish I had time to get into how that whole group got into ancestor worship and all this. I just don't have time tonight. But it's all directly related to these concepts, how they started pulling in ancestor worship that became some of the tenets of Chinese faith that's still there today. But over the years, the Chinese people have actually asked Shemitic people or Christian people, tell us about Yahweh. They've always been incredibly open to that. And I know here with the Mandarin group that we have, when folks come from China, from mainland China on work visas or student visas, they like to come and learn about Yahweh at this church. They're very sensitive to these things. It's deeply in their culture because, if you will, they grew up in it way back when. The Jebusites, that's Jerusalem. The Amorites were a very, very powerful people that eventually conquered Babylon from the descendants of Nimrod. And that's really important because you've heard of Hammurabi. The term Amorite or Amruru, I can't even say it, is part of his name. He was an Amorite. And they're going to show up a whole bunch of times. The Girgashites, all these other ites. Matter of fact, the Girgashites are probably the most interesting because the name Gadarenes that we read in the New Testament comes from the word Girgashites. Interestingly enough, all of these people, they really don't have, the peoples that are left of these people don't have any problems with the historicity of the Bible. As a matter of fact, we call it the Great Wall of China. Do you know what the people of northern China call the Great Wall of China? They call it the Great Wall of, come on, my brain is going too slow. They call it the Great Wall of Magog. Is what they call it, because the people groups that are above them, which are they're now Russian, but the Siberian peoples and the Mongols that are now above them were people descended from Magog. And you can go back and start drawing the line. These people are from two different clans that think two different ways, and they are enemies. And the Chinese people at this time, when that Great Wall came in, said, we will not be ruled by Japhethites. Noah said, we'll be their slaves. We will not be their slaves. Let's build a big wall and keep them out. They don't have any problem with this. Verse 20. Verse 21. Shem, Japheth's older brother, also had sons. Shem was the father of all the sons of Eber. Eber, Hebrew. That's where we get that term. It is a name that means one who crosses over, or he crossed over, and it is fantastically deep. But I'm told I can't tell you about that. Let me finish this chapter. I need 10 minutes, maybe 15. You can go home if you want. I got a car. Hebrew. I won't dig into that too much, but we're going to see when we start studying Abram that he is one who has crossed over as we should be. Shem's sons were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. These guys are interesting. You've heard the term Semitic or anti-Semitic. That comes from the term Shem, anti-Shemitic, people who are against the sons of Shem. He had sons, Elam, Elamites, we've heard about them. Asser, that's Assyria, we've heard about them. Ashurbanipal, the great king, that names comes from that. Arphaxad, the Assyrians called them the Chaldu, which is where we get the term Chaldean. And that's where Eber and Abram come from. And we talk about them because Abram was from Ur of the Chaldeans. That's where that come from. Lud, that's part of Western Turkey. We mentioned that. And Arameans, we'll talk about them a whole lot. Aram had 4 sons. The one we really care about is Uz. Uz lived in the eastern part of the land that we currently call the Middle East, in a big basin there. He founded a city there called Uz. He had a descendant whose name was Job. And we read about him. That's very important to us. And then Shelah, Eber, Peleg, and Joktan. That's really interesting. When you read about Peleg, at the verse 25, Eber had 2 sons. One was named Peleg, for during his days the earth was divided. That term earth is the term eretz, and it means land. The land, or the actual earth, was divided. And that term divided doesn't have to do with the land separating. It indicates that the land was split up. How was it split up? Well, I unfortunately don't have the time to dig into the math here to help you understand the specifics of it, but here's what we do know. After the flood, the ice caps were huge. We were in the ice ages, which we have plenty of history on. As those huge sheets of ice that covered like all of Europe and what's now South America, as those begin to melt, the sea level rose significantly. As it rose significantly, it divided up the land. Used to be able to walk from France to England to Italy. France to England to Ireland. You can't do that anymore. There's water there now. Well, yeah, as those glaciers ran down and melted, they cut channels, they flooded things. Used to be able to walk from Siberia to North America. But you can't do that now. Well, maybe sometimes a year, but I wouldn't advise it. Anyway, you used to be able to do that, but now you can't. Because as the sea levels rose, all of those pieces of land were covered. How did the animals get all over the earth? Well, they didn't swim, they walked. That's also how people got all over the earth. That's how the Aboriginals got to Australia. They walked. That's how they got there. And then eventually, as sea levels rose, that became impossible. And apparently there was a terrific warming during the period of this one guy, or as he was coming, the warming was happening and he was born, and they named him after these separations. So that's very interesting. There's a bunch of people that he fathered that we don't get to talk about tonight. And those are Shem's sons by their clans according to their languages and in their nations. Those are the clans of Noah, according to their family records. The nations on earth spread out after the flood. Now, I want to talk about the Tower of Babel, but I want to tell you something. It's not about language. Don't you remember being in Sunday school and they show you the picture of the Tower of Babel and there's a guy down at the bottom speaking some weird thing, carrying a brick, and another guy, what'd you say? That's not the point. Well, what is this? How did God? That's not the point of the Tower of Babel. That's not the point. And I'll tell you, you can find the point in the Hebrew understanding of the word Babel. Remember what Babel means? Remember what Babel means? Gateway to God. This is how we're going to reach God, and eventually, Nimrod said, this is how I'm going to become my own God, is with Babel. Gateway to God. But the Hebrews called it confusion. Why? Because they couldn't understand each other? No. Do you want to be confused? Do you want a confused society and a confused people? Then try to be your own God. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. The whole earth had the same lip and the same words, it said. So this is pretty early on. It's during the time of a king named Nimrod. Remember him? We just talked about him. The people who migrated east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar. We just talked to them. Do you guys remember how Hebrews tell a story? I'm going to tell you a story about Noah. I'm going to tell you a story about the sons of Noah. I'm going to tell you a story about Nimrod. I'm going to tell you about when Nimrod's people went to Shinar. That's where we're at now. Nimrod's people go to Shinar, and they settled there, and they said, come, let us make oven-fired bricks. They used brick for stone. Why? Because there are no stones there to cut up. And so they learned how to make mud bricks. And actually, this system of mud bricks and asphalt or tar for mortar is well documented. This is what they did. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower to the sky and make our name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered throughout the earth. Let's make a name for ourselves so we can all stay together. What did God tell them to do when He gave them the covenant? What are the words that He said? Chapter 9, verse 7, but you be fruitful and multiply, spread out over the earth and multiply on it. What did the Japhethites do? They spread out over the earth and multiplied on it. What did the Canaanites do? Oh no, we're going to stay together. That's where we find these people. That's where we find them, is trying to stay together. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Then, this is the funniest part. Okay, we're going to build a tower so tall that we can get to the heavens on our own. We're going to build a tower so tall that God couldn't wipe it out if He tried. I love the way that this is said. Verse 5, the Lord came down. It literally means the Lord climbed down and stooped low. Like He had to go down a bunch of stairs, climb down a ladder, get into a pit, and stoop really low to see their puny little tower. They built one so big. And God said, can you get me a magnifying? I can't even see that thing down there. Verse 6, the Lord said, if they've begun to do this as one people and having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That does not mean He is scared of them. It does not mean He is scared of them. What it means is, if they keep going, they're really going to get messed up. The whole flood thing was to give them a new start, and look what's happening. They are making a counterfeit religion that will destroy them. If they keep going, this concept of nothing will be impossible for them is a negative. It's a negative term. They're getting worse and worse and worse, and if they keep going like this, they're going to get so bad that they're going to destroy themselves now. God is all about grace. We read about the Amorites just a minute ago. The Amorites were some incredibly wicked people. They were really well known for sacrificing babies. We'll talk about Molech and the Amorites at one point. God gave them 400 years to repent. You remember the Ninevites? I'm going to destroy them, a horribly corrupt people. Jonah, let them know. Maybe they'll turn. I'm not going to let them know. They'll probably turn. No, let them know. Maybe they'll turn. And they did. And they got another 120 years. God is known for His grace. He is not afraid of these people. I've got to do something to stop them. So let us go down there and confuse their language so that they won't understand one another's speech. Let's give them different words. You know, building a ziggurat wasn't something you did in 2 weeks. It would take lifetimes to build a ziggurat. Lifetimes. Over the course of those lifetimes, clans come and go, people come and go, dialects come and go. And in my mind, that is likely what happened. Let's do that. So from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. He took these people of Nimrod and scattered them throughout the earth. Now, that's good that they were scattered and couldn't do that anymore, but they brought this paganism with them everywhere that they went. Verse 9, therefore it is called Babylon, for there the Lord confused their words, or confused their lip of the whole earth, and there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. And that's where we're going to stop tonight, and we'll pick back up with Shem later. I skipped dramatically more than I brought you tonight. So there are more questions than answers in that. What I want you to see from that is a couple of things. I want you to see how the people groups spread out so that you can understand. We're about to read about how they hate each other and trying to kill each other. I want you to understand how that works. I want you to understand where this animosity comes from that we still deal with today between the people groups, and how it is that some people just seem to be so open to hear about Yahweh God, and some people just don't. I want you to see that, and to gain this foundation of where we're going, and also to understand that there were many peoples on the earth that followed Yahweh God. He is often referred to as God Most High, God Most High, or the Most High God in these histories. Oh yeah, but I only read about all these pagans. Yeah, because they're the ones who started writing things down first with cuneiform. They're the ones that spread out and brought this counterfeit. And the nice thing about the counterfeit is it can be anything you want it to be. I can be my own God, and we end up right back where we started. So next week, we're going to pick up with Abram, and we're going to see how God answered this dramatic violence that begins to happen, how he answered it so kindly and quietly and so full of grace. And that's the way that God works. All right, next week will probably have to be a question and answer. All right, let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for giving us a few extra minutes and allowing us to look at this incredibly interesting story of the division of the people. How I thank you that you've been gracious enough to us to allow us here to stand in Shem's tent, to be covered by the knowledge of you. We thank you, Lord. Amen.